In 1947, the city of Los Angeles was rocked by one of the most shocking and mysterious true crime cases in American history: the brutal murder of Elizabeth Short, better known as the Black Dahlia. To this day, her death remains one of the most famous unsolved crimes in the world. Elizabeth Short was born in 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts. From a young age, she was known for her striking beauty, with dark hair and sharp, captivating features. After her parents' separation when she was a child, Elizabeth moved to California to live with her father, but it didn't take long before she ended up in Los Angeles in search of fame and fortune. She dreamed of becoming an actress, but despite some minor roles in Hollywood films, she never achieved the recognition she craved. She worked several odd jobs to support herself, and it was reported that she had a number of romantic relationships, but none seemed to last. Despite her hardships, Elizabeth never gave up on her dream of becoming a star. But it was this dream, and perhaps her own naivety, that made her an easy target for those with darker intentions. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman walking with her child through a park in Leimert, Los Angeles, made a grisly discovery. She noticed what she first thought was a discarded mannequin lying in the grass. Upon closer inspection, she realized it was a woman's body, horribly mutilated. The body was dismembered at the waist, with the top half severed cleanly from the lower part. The victim had been sliced in half, and her body was positioned in a grotesque pose, with her arms raised above her head, her legs spread apart. Her face was grotesquely slashed from the corners of her mouth to her ears, creating an eerie smile. Her eyes were missing, and there were signs of other horrific wounds, including deep cuts to her abdomen. But shockingly, there was no blood at the crime scene. The body was later identified as Elizabeth Short, the woman who had become known to the media as the Black Dahlia. Her distinctive appearance and tragic story caught the attention of the public, but it also attracted the interest of the press, who eagerly speculated about her past and the circumstances surrounding her brutal death. The Los Angeles Police Department was soon on the scene, but what they uncovered only deepened the mystery. Elizabeth's body had been cleaned before being dumped in the park, suggesting that the killer had an intimate knowledge of crime scenes and possibly even medical procedures. There were signs that the murderer had taken great care in his gruesome work, making the crime seem particularly personal and deliberate. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details began to emerge. Elizabeth had been known to frequent several bars and had a few acquaintances in Hollywood, but there was no solid evidence connecting her to any of her previous lovers or friends. In fact, many people came forward claiming to have had relationships with her, but no one seemed to know much about her personal life. In the days following the discovery of her body, dozens of men came forward claiming to be in love with her, but none of their statements led to any concrete leads. The police eventually found a clue that seemed to hold promise: a mysterious letter sent to the press, signed the Black Dahlia Avenger. The letter was postmarked from Los Angeles, and its contents hinted that the killer had been following Elizabeth Short for some time before committing the murder. The letter contained disturbing details about the crime scene that had not been made public, indicating that the killer was intimately familiar with the case. The letter included a chilling promise: "I'll be back when I get the rest of the pieces." But that was the last anyone heard from the killer. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed about who was responsible for Elizabeth Short's murder. The case was widely covered in the media, and many suspects were brought forward, though none were ever definitively proven to be the killer. One theory centers around George Hoddle, a prominent physician who was suspected of involvement in several other unsolved murders in Los Angeles. Hoddle's own daughter, who had become estranged from him, later claimed that her father had confessed to the crime on his deathbed. In 2003, retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel, George's son, published a book in which he detailed his suspicions that his father was the Black Dahlia killer. According to Steve, his father's medical knowledge and his bizarre behavior suggested that he was responsible for the murder, but despite this, there was no conclusive evidence to charge him. Another theory involves a man named Leslie Dillon, a bellboy who was allegedly obsessed with Elizabeth Short. Dillon had been in Los Angeles around the time of the murder, and had interacted with several of the people who had been connected to her. He had even been questioned by the police but was eventually released due to lack of evidence. However, in recent years, some criminologists have suggested that Dylan may have been responsible, especially given his odd behavior after the murder. Some experts even theorize that Elizabeth Short's killer could have been someone much closer to her, perhaps someone she trusted or even dated. One disturbing idea is that the crime could have been committed by a person Elizabeth knew and possibly even trusted. Someone who had access to her, could manipulate her, and who ultimately carried out the horrific act. But just like many other suspects, this theory remains unproven. Despite numerous attempts by law enforcement and private investigators to solve the crime, Elizabeth Short's murder remains unsolved. The Black Dahlia case has become an iconic part of American true crime history, inspiring countless books, documentaries, films, and even conspiracy theories. In addition to being a gruesome and mysterious crime, the case raises unsettling questions about the darker side of fame, the brutal treatment of women in the media, and the disturbing ways that people can disappear into the shadows of society without ever being fully understood. What makes Elizabeth Short's case so haunting is not only the shocking nature of her death, but the fact that it occurred in the city of Los Angeles, the land of dreams. The same city that promised her fame and success instead became the final resting place of one of its most tragic and mysterious victims. To this day, Elizabeth Short's story is a chilling reminder that some crimes never truly fade away. The Black Dahlia case remains one of the greatest mysteries in true crime history, a puzzle with no solution, a ghost story of Hollywood's dark past. Decades have passed since the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body, but her name and her unsolved murder continue to haunt Los Angeles. The Black Dahlia case has become a symbol of Hollywood's dark underbelly, where dreams of fame and success are often intertwined with secrets, deception, and tragedy. The haunting image of her face cut into a macabre smile is etched into the collective memory of those fascinated by unsolved mysteries. Despite the relentless efforts of law enforcement, private investigators, and even family members, Elizabeth Short's killer has never been identified. In recent years, the case has been reopened and re-examined by cold case detectives. But as of today, no new evidence has emerged to conclusively solve the crime. Some, like Steve Hoddle, continue to push for justice, convinced that the answer lies buried within their own family's history. But the truth remains elusive. For Elizabeth Short, the world has not forgotten her. She is remembered not just as the victim of a heinous crime, but as a symbol of vulnerability, a young woman who came to Hollywood searching for a dream, only to have her life brutally cut short. Her story has been immortalized in countless documentaries, books, and films, making her a tragic icon of the noir era. But the questions still linger. Who was the man who ended her life, and why? Every year on the anniversary of her death, the media revisits the mystery. New theories surface, old ones are revisited, and people continue to speculate about the possibility of a breakthrough. Some say that the answer is hidden in plain sight, while others believe that the truth may be lost forever, like the body of the woman who became the Black Dahlia. The case may remain unsolved, but the legend of the Black Dahlia lives on, forever a part of Los Angeles' haunted history, and a chilling reminder of how easily beauty, dreams, and lives can be shattered in the shadows of fame. Samantha had always been the type of person who thrived in the quiet of suburban life. She moved to Oakwood Hills a few months ago after a stressful job transfer had pulled her away from the city. The neighborhood was the kind of place that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a magazine. Tree-lined streets, neat lawns, houses with freshly painted porches, and neighbors who waved at you as you walked by. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. At first, Samantha had been apprehensive about settling into such a sleepy town. She wasn't used to the slow pace of life, the absence of constant noise, and the unspoken expectation to know everyone in the area. But as time passed, she started to appreciate it. She had found a small, modest house on the corner of Maple Street, just a few houses down from the Parkers. The couple had lived there for years, it seemed, always friendly, always warm. They were the type of neighbors who'd bring over a pie when you first moved in, invite you for a cup of tea, and check in on you, when they hadn't seen you for a while. One evening, just a few weeks into her new life in Oakwood Hills, Mrs. Parker stopped by with a dinner invitation. "We're having lasagna tonight," she said, "and we'd love for you to join us. You've been working so hard, it's time you got a little break." Samantha hesitated. She was never the best at small talk, but she couldn't turn down such a kind gesture. The Parkers had been nothing but welcoming since her arrival, and she figured it would be a good chance to get to know them better. "I'll be there at 6, she told Mrs. Parker. That evening, she made her way next door. The smell of garlic and fresh basil greeted her as soon as she stepped through the front door. Mr. Parker was in the kitchen, humming a tune under his breath while stirring a pot. Mrs. Parker, with her thick silver hair and warm smile, ushered Samantha into the dining room. The conversation flowed easily at first. They spoke about Oakwood Hills, about the neighbors, about how peaceful the area was. But the longer Samantha sat there, the more she began to notice subtle things that didn't quite sit right with her. The Parkers had a large, beautiful house. Everything was meticulously clean and well kept. The walls were lined with framed photos, family pictures, vacation snapshots, the typical kind of memories you'd expect to see in a home. But as she glanced at one of the photos in particular, something caught her eye. It was a picture of the Parkers standing in front of an old rundown building. The image was grainy and faded, but what was unsettling was the look in Mrs. Parker's eyes. They seemed distant, almost hollow. Mr. Parker had his arm around her shoulders, but his smile looked forced, his eyes darting away from the camera. Samantha couldn't explain it, but the longer she stared at that photo, the more uneasy she became. Still, she tried to push it out of her mind. It was probably nothing. The dinner went on, and for a while, things seemed normal. They spoke about their travels, about the town's history, about the people they had known. But as the evening wore on, Samantha started noticing something odd. Every time she asked the Parkers a question about their past, how long they had lived in Oakwood Hills where they'd grown up, there was a noticeable pause before they answered. Their responses were always polite but vague. "Oh, we've been around here a long time," Mr. Parker would say, his eyes shifting nervously. "Not much to tell, really." Mrs. Parker smiled and nodded, but her gaze lingered on Samantha just a little too long, as though she were evaluating her. It felt like they were hiding something. When dinner ended, Mrs. Parker offered to show Samantha a little more of the house. Samantha had a small apartment back in the city and had never been inside a home like this before. The Parkers led her upstairs, where they showed her the guest room and an extra bedroom. As they walked through the hallway, Samantha couldn't help but notice the door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar. Beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. Mrs. Parker, noticing Samantha's curious glance, smiled tightly. "Oh, that's just the attic. We don't use it much. Too much dust up there." The way she said it made it sound like she was offering an explanation, but Samantha felt as if there was something else behind it. At around 9 p.m., Samantha excused herself and made her way home. She was feeling a little more uneasy than she had earlier, but she tried to convince herself it was all in her head. The Parkers were good people. It was just the weirdness of the night, the odd photo, the vague answers. She was probably just overthinking things. That night, as she lay in bed, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She tried to push it aside, but as the hours passed, she heard a strange noise, a scraping sound that seemed to come from the direction of the Parkers' house. At first, it was so soft that she thought it was just her imagination. But as it continued, the noise became more distinct, something scraping across the ground, followed by a muffled thud. She sat up in bed, listening intently. The sounds were faint, but they were definitely there. The scraping, then silence, then the thudding again. It almost sounded like dragging. She thought about calling the police, but quickly dismissed the idea. She couldn't just call them for something that might be nothing. What if it was just the sound of the wind, or an animal moving around? Still, the noise kept her up. She stared at the ceiling, unable to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. What if something was happening next door? Unable to sleep, Samantha got out of bed and walked to the window. She cautiously peered through the blinds, trying to see if anything was out of place. For a moment, the street outside seemed completely still. No movement, no cars, no sign of life. But then she saw it. Mr. Parker was standing in the garage, his back to the window. His hands were covered in something dark. He held a large, heavy tarp in front of him. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she watched him drag it across the garage floor, his movements slow, deliberate. The sight of the tarp was enough to make her stomach churn. It looked heavy, like it was concealing something. Samantha's heart raced. She couldn't look away, even though she knew she should. Was it blood? Was he hiding something? Her mind spun with 1,000 thoughts, each one more horrific than the last. Just as she began to reach for her phone to call the police, Mr. Parker stopped. He turned his head, glancing quickly around the yard, as if he could sense someone was watching. Samantha froze. For a split second, their eyes met, and the chill in his gaze sent a wave of terror through her. Then he quickly moved out of sight, retreating into the shadows of the garage. Her hands were shaking as she dialed 911. "There's something going on next door," she stammered, her voice shaky. "I don't know what it is, but I think they're hiding something. I saw Mr. Parker dragging something in his garage. It looked like a body. Please, you have to come." The dispatcher urged her to stay inside and wait for the officers to arrive. But the waiting was the worst part. Samantha could hardly breathe, her mind racing with horrible thoughts of what she might have seen. Was Mr. Parker really capable of something like that? What had happened to the body? When the police arrived, they knocked on the Parkers' door, but no one answered. After a brief conversation, the officers decided to conduct a search of the house. Samantha felt a wave of relief as she watched the officers approach the garage. But when they returned an hour later, they had nothing to show for it. There was no evidence of what she had seen, and the Parkers had vanished. The officers assured her that they would continue the investigation, but Samantha wasn't convinced. She knew what she had seen. They were hiding something. Over the next few days, Samantha tried to push the incident from her mind, but the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. She couldn't ignore the fact that the Parkers had been involved in something dark, something twisted, and she was sure that she had stumbled upon it. Then a week later, she received a call from Detective Harris, a veteran officer from the Oakwood Hills Police Department. "We need you to come with us," he said, his voice grim. "We found something, and we need your help." The detective led Samantha to an abandoned warehouse just outside of town. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. The walls were covered with photographs, photos of missing people, their faces torn or blurred out. Among them were recent pictures of Samantha, taken from her own home, her front porch, her driveway. As they dug deeper into the warehouse, they uncovered a hidden room, a makeshift torture chamber, filled with bloodstains, remnants of what looked like old, decaying bodies, and an assortment of tools that had no place in a suburban home. The Parkers had been running a twisted operation for years, abducting people from nearby neighborhoods, torturing them, and selling them to the highest bidder. The worst part? The Parkers had been living next door to Samantha all along. They had been watching her, waiting for the right moment. And now the realization hit hard. She had almost been their next victim. When the police found the Parkers' house, it was empty. No trace of them remained. But the horror of what had happened there would stay with Samantha forever. The Parkers were not just her neighbors, they were monsters hiding in plain sight. And that wraps up today's story. I really hope it resonated with you or gave you something to think about. Stories like these are what keep me passionate about creating, and your support makes it all worthwhile. If you've got any thoughts, opinions, or even your own experiences to share, don't hold back. Drop them in the comments. I'd love to start a conversation and hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, make sure you stick around. I've got plenty more coming that I think you'll love. Thanks so much for watching, for being here, and for supporting this journey. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.